My name is Thalia Ward. I'm 34 years old. And at 6:12 on a Thursday night, standing in a narrow hospital service hallway with my ID badge still clipped to my blouse, and the smell of burnt coffee and disinfectant clinging to my jacket, I listened to a text-to-voice message from my mother that should have broken me. Instead, it made everything painfully clear. Before I tell you what my mother said, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you find this story touching. And let me know where you started listening and what time it is right now. I'm happy to connect with listeners from all over the world. Okay? Now I'll continue. Her voice was cool, precise, almost elegant in that rehearsed way she used whenever she wanted to sound blameless in front of other people. Don't contact us again. We're done. We're moving on without you. Then the message ended. Just like that. Not like a mother speaking to her daughter. More like a judge closing a case she had already decided I would lose. I stood there staring at the pale concrete wall while an orderly rolled a supply cart past me and an alarm pulsed somewhere deeper in the building. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. My phone stayed warm in my hand. I didn't cry. I didn't call her back either. I played the message again, then once more. Not because I hadn't heard it the first time, but because I needed to hear the contempt clearly enough to stop making excuses for them. My family hadn't suddenly rejected me that night. They had only finally said out loud what they had been showing me for years. I was valuable when I was useful, when I was fixing last-minute problems, reviewing paperwork nobody else bothered to read, covering gaps they created and pretending for the sake of appearances that everything in the Ward family was stable, polished, under control. But the moment I stopped being easy to use, I became easy to discard. That was the truth. So I sent back exactly one word. Okay. By 8 o'clock the next morning, permissions had been revoked, a property transaction stalled, and the first fracture in the future they had been showing off to everyone around them had already started to split straight down the middle. The next part of the story contains some fictional elements and uses AI to clarify the message and enhance the emotional experience. If you empathize, I greatly appreciate it. If not, I hope you have a peaceful evening and a good night's sleep. Here's what my mother didn't understand when she sent that message. She thought she was finally discarding the family disappointment. What she actually cut off was the one person who knew exactly where every weak support beam was hidden inside the house they were pretending would never collapse. My name is Thalia Ward, but in my family I had slowly become something else. Not a daughter, not a sister, infrastructure. I wasn't an ATM with emotions attached. I was the person who had spent the last 6 years quietly untangling every financial mess they created and then conveniently labeled as temporary bad luck. My background wasn't in banking or real estate. I worked in forensic compliance for hospital foundations and private care networks. My job was to track where money was supposed to go, where it actually went, and what happened when people tried to clean up questionable decisions with paperwork and a trusted signature. It turns out that skill set was very convenient for a family that believed problems could be erased if someone else handled the details. My parents never respected what I did for a living, but they absolutely loved what my work could do for them. Over time, I became the one who reviewed contracts they never bothered to read. I corrected tax exposures they didn't understand. I structured payment schedules they couldn't realistically afford. I translated complicated financial consequences into language simple enough for them to ignore. The latest situation they had pulled me into was their grand downsizing plan. My parents, Victor Ward and Eleanor Ward, had been bragging about it for months. They were telling friends they were selling the old family house and moving into an elegant gated townhouse by the lake. A fresh start. A new chapter. A more sophisticated lifestyle. What they didn't mention was that the entire plan only existed because I had agreed against my better judgment to oversee part of the financial verification process. Not ownership, not anything illegal, just administrative trust. I had agreed to confirm documentation for the source of funds, oversee the legal access chain for a temporary escrow bridge, and maintain shared authorization over 2 linked accounts until the closing was complete. The kind of quiet, logistical support families take for granted when they assume you will always rescue them. At 7:43 the next morning, I was sitting at my kitchen island with my laptop open and my coffee untouched, while my mother's message replayed in my mind like a ticking clock. Don't contact us again. Fine. So I did exactly what any competent professional would do when a hostile party severs contact while still depending on her cooperation. I withdrew. I notified the title coordinator that I was no longer serving as the verification contact for the financial documentation. I emailed the broker and formally revoked my authorization to communicate on the transaction. I flagged the shared access credentials for suspension until identity verification could be re-established without my involvement. Then I sent a short, perfectly polite message to the family accountant explaining that any document previously routed through me would need to be reissued without my credentials, my review chain, or my indemnification language attached. No arguments, no threats, no dramatic speech about revenge. Just a series of clean legal withdrawals from systems that only functioned because I was inside them. The consequences started showing up faster than I expected. Within an hour, the townhouse closing stalled because the seller's legal team refused to proceed without complete verification on the transfer. A restoration contractor my father had already hired to prepare the old house suddenly paused the move-out schedule because the deposit confirmation didn't process in the expected format. Then another message arrived from a private care residence my mother had been contacting. They politely requested updated payment assurances before they could reserve the suite she had apparently been bragging about to her friends. That was the moment I stopped typing. Because that detail revealed something my parents hadn't told me. They weren't just planning a luxury move. They were relocating my grandmother Margaret Ellis too. And they had been making promises that only made sense if they believed I would keep stabilizing every landing. Around noon, my phone finally lit up. The first call came in. I watched it ring. Then another. Then 6 more. It's interesting how quickly "don't contact us again" turns into "why aren't you answering" once paperwork stops moving. Some families only believe in boundaries when they're the ones drawing them. And the first voice message that appeared on my screen wasn't my mother's. It was my father's. His voice sounded tight, controlled in that way people sound when panic is trying to break through. And that was when I realized something important. The system they had been leaning on for years had just stopped working, and they had no idea how much of their future depended on it. The first thing I heard was panic wearing my father's voice like a cheap suit. Victor Ward left 2 voicemails before noon. In the first one, he tried to sound calm, the way people do when they think composure might still control the situation. "Thalia, there's been a misunderstanding. Call us when you get this." 20 minutes later, the calm was gone. "You need to call us today." By 3 in the afternoon, the strained dignity had cracked completely. "The title company says there's a hold. Claire at the office says you pulled your authorizations. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this has to be fixed before the end of the day." I saved the messages and went back to work. At the time, I was reviewing an audit trail connected to a donor-funded oncology wing expansion. It was detailed work that required attention, the kind of analysis where missing one small inconsistency could hide an entire chain of financial misrepresentation. Meanwhile, my phone kept lighting up beside my keyboard. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Each vibration sounded a little more desperate than the one before it. When I finally glanced down at the screen, I noticed something almost funny. The Ward family group chat, which had been silent for weeks, was suddenly alive again. Apparently, my existence had been restored the moment their timeline started collapsing. I didn't open the messages right away. I finished the section of the audit I was reviewing, saved my notes, and only later that evening did I finally scroll through the conversation. My sister Lydia Ward hadn't asked what happened. She accused me. How could you do this right before the move mom is humiliated? Do you even understand the damage you're causing? There it was again. The familiar family equation. Their decisions. My fault. Their lies. My responsibility. Their embarrassment. My emergency. I almost typed a reply. Then a voicemail transcription from my mother appeared on my screen, and I read it twice because the hypocrisy was so perfect, it felt like someone had written it for a bad television drama. Eleanor Ward called me vindictive. She called me unstable. She called me ungrateful. And in the exact same message, she demanded that I fix the paperwork issue immediately. There was no apology for cutting me off. No acknowledgement that she had explicitly told me not to contact them again. Just outrage that I had respected her instructions. The moment that changed everything came later that night when I opened an email thread I had nearly ignored. It came from a care liaison at the private residence my mother had been negotiating with for my grandmother, Margaret Ellis. The message was polite and professionally worded. They weren't asking me to pay anything. They were asking me to confirm whether the funding structure previously described by the family was still valid. According to their records, the deposit for my grandmother's placement was tied to the expected proceeds from the townhouse purchase, which depended on the sale of the old Ward house, which now appeared to be stalled. The liaison didn't say anything accusatory, but the implication was brutal. My mother had been shopping for a prestige care facility she couldn't actually secure without stacking one unstable promise on top of another. The entire structure relied on one assumption: that I would keep everything stable. And 2 days after telling me not to contact them again, they were discovering what happened when that assumption disappeared. 48 hours after my mother's message, my phone showed 58 missed calls, not 79. Not some exaggerated number designed for drama. 58. And each one marked the speed at which control was draining from people who had spent years treating me like a backup generator they could kick whenever the lights went out. The calls came from my parents, from Lydia, from 2 numbers I didn't recognize, from the broker handling the property, from a contractor working on the house. Then at 8:17 p.m., a message arrived that finally made me realize the situation was bigger than a delayed closing. The message came from a law office. Ms. Ward, this is Daniel Pike representing your parents. We have a serious problem and need to speak tonight. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I looked back at my mother's message telling me not to contact them again. Serious problem. Those words sound very different when they come from someone who charges by the hour. I typed exactly 6 words. Enjoy moving forward. You said that first. Then I turned my phone face down and let them sit inside the silence they had tried to give me. The next morning, I learned what the serious problem actually was. And it wasn't just a house. It was reputation, leverage, and a paper trail people assume will never be exposed because the person who knows it is family. Around mid-morning, Daniel Pike called again, this time from a different number. This time, I answered. Lawyers don't start sounding dramatic unless something expensive is already on fire. His voice was controlled, careful, almost irritatingly calm. Ms. Ward, he said, there appear to be some unexpected complications regarding the property sequence. He paused as if choosing his words very carefully. Then he added something that made me lean back in my chair. It would be very helpful if we could clarify your current involvement. That was when I realized something. My family hadn't just built their plans on my reliability, they had built their credibility on my name. And now the entire structure was starting to shake. Daniel Pike stayed quiet for a moment after I asked him to speak plainly. I could almost hear him deciding how much truth he was allowed to give me. Then he did. He explained that there had been unexpected complications involving the property transaction sequence, the assisted living reservation for my grandmother, Margaret Ellis, and certain statements my parents had made to third parties regarding their available liquidity. That was the polite version. so I asked him to drop the professional language and tell me what was actually happening. There was another pause. Then he did. My parents, Victor and Eleanor Ward, had already presented themselves to the townhouse seller, the private care residence, and at least one charitable board as fully funded for a major lifestyle transition. Apparently, my mother had been leaning heavily on that image. Eleanor sat on the fundraising committee of a boutique elder care charity, and according to Daniel Pike, she had been using the upcoming move as proof of the family's financial stability. She had hinted about hosting a donor reception in the new townhouse once the move was complete. She had mentioned a potential sponsorship package for the charity's next campaign. She had told several people that the Ward family was consolidating assets smoothly, except the liquidity wasn't smooth. It was fragile. My father had been carrying business debt that I had never seen in any of the documentation he previously showed me. My sister Lydia had quietly maxed out a joint emergency credit line that was supposed to remain untouched unless the entire family faced a genuine crisis. And the old house, the property they were counting on to finance everything else, needed structural repairs serious enough to scare off any cautious buyer if they were disclosed late in the process. They weren't moving forward from strength. They were racing ahead before anyone noticed the cracks. I asked Daniel Pike the only question that actually mattered to me. Did anyone forge my review or imply I was still overseeing these transactions after I withdrew? His silence lasted just long enough to give me my answer. When he finally spoke, his wording was careful. Some parties may have relied on prior understandings involving your role. That's lawyer language for something very simple. Someone had gotten comfortable using my credibility after they no longer had my consent. My chest went cold, but not with anger, with certainty. I told him that from that moment forward I would communicate only in writing. He immediately started pushing back. He mentioned family stress. He mentioned my grandmother's transition. He mentioned my mother's blood pressure and the sensitivity of the situation. I cut him off. A serious problem for them, I said, calmly, does not create an obligation for me. Then I ended the call. The rest of the truth began arriving in fragments. Later that afternoon, a member of the charity board forwarded me an attachment. I couldn't tell whether it was sent accidentally or intentionally, but the message was clear. It was a draft invitation for a donor evening, hosted by my mother, at the lakefront townhouse, the same townhouse they had not actually purchased yet. The invitation praised the Ward family's continued commitment to dignified elder support. It described Eleanor Ward as a devoted daughter navigating the emotional challenge of relocating her aging mother while continuing to serve the community. Reading it made my stomach twist. My grandmother wasn't being treated like a person. She was being used as a prop in a branding campaign built on money that didn't exist. Then another detail surfaced. I discovered that Lydia had been telling several people that I was handling the compliance side of the family's transition. It sounded impressive enough to reassure outsiders, and vague enough to leave me responsible if everything collapsed. That was the moment the situation stopped being about hurt feelings. It became about survival. If my parents' carefully staged lifestyle fantasy collapsed, while my name floated anywhere near the paperwork, I wouldn't just be the daughter they used. I would be the professional whose credibility got dragged through their mess. So I did what I always do when things become dangerous. I documented everything. My mother's message cutting me off. The timestamps showing when I revoked my authorizations. The email confirming my withdrawal from the property verification process. The message from the care facility asking for updated financial assurances. The donor event draft. The accusations from Lydia. I built a clean digital folder the same way I would assemble any professional case file. Not to destroy anyone recklessly, just to make sure the truth had structure if I ever needed it. That same afternoon, my mother finally stopped pretending she was the injured party. She called from a blocked number. When I answered, she didn't say hello. Her voice came through the speaker low and sharp. How dare you embarrass us like this? Not how dare you abandon your family? Not why are you doing this? Embarrass us. That was the center of her universe. Image, reputation, appearance. I told her quietly that embarrassment usually happens when someone builds a public life on promises they can't afford to keep. She snapped immediately. She said everything they had ever done was for the family. She called me selfish, cold. She said I had become impossible to love lately. And listening to her, I realized something strange. For the first time in years, none of those words had any power over me. Because once you finally see the pattern clearly, manipulation stops feeling like truth. It just feels predictable. If you think I was right to withdraw my support and refuse to clean up the mess after they told me to stay out of their lives, type 1 in the comments. Then my mother made the mistake that burned away the last hesitation I had been carrying. She said, "After everything we sacrificed for you, you owe us cooperation." Owed. That word sat in the air like something heavy and rotten. Not love, not loyalty, debt. The same invisible debt they had been collecting from me since I was 21 years old, the moment I became the first person in the family who understood contracts, deadlines, and consequences. If anyone listening to this story has ever wondered when the villains in a family finally become obvious, this was the moment. Because the truth is, their cruelty didn't begin with one message telling me not to contact them again. It started years earlier. It started the day my father, Victor Ward, quietly borrowed money from my graduate school fund to cover the embarrassment of a failed investment. When I found out, I was told not to be dramatic because family helps family. It deepened the year my mother Eleanor pressured me to skip a fellowship interview I had spent months preparing for, so I could help organize a charity luncheon she wanted photographed for the local society pages. She said the opportunity would come again. It didn't. And the pattern hardened. The night my sister Lydia sat crying on my couch about overdue bills, swore she had nowhere else to turn, and accepted the money I wired her the next morning. 3 weeks later, she was posting vacation photos beside a resort pool. Every time I objected, I was called cold. Every time I fixed the problem, I was called family. Some of you probably recognize that trap immediately. 3 nights after my mother's call, the situation finally exploded. Just not the way she expected. Remember the donor event invitation I mentioned earlier, the one she had been circulating for a reception at a townhouse she didn't even own yet? It turned out she had not canceled the committee event attached to that fundraising campaign. She had only changed the location. Instead of hosting it at the imaginary townhouse, she moved the gathering back to the charity's historic conservatory, and told everyone the venue change was simply a logistical adjustment. A mutual contact forwarded me the updated invitation. Under the attachment was a single sentence. "You might want to know what's being said about you." At first, I almost ignored it. Then I opened the file. My mother had been introducing herself to donors as a woman under enormous emotional strain. A devoted daughter caring for her aging mother while also carrying the burden of an estranged daughter who had chosen resentment over responsibility. She wasn't just cutting me out privately. She was rewriting the story publicly before the collapse of her plans could land on her reputation. So I went. I didn't go dressed to cause a scene. I didn't show up with security or a stack of documents like some dramatic courtroom reveal. I went the way people least expect trouble to arrive. Quiet. Early. Dressed like someone who belongs in rooms where lies are expected to stand up straight. The conservatory was filled with glass walls, winter greenery, polished wood, and wealthy people pretending empathy while sipping champagne. I saw my mother immediately. Eleanor Ward stood across the room smiling with that warm, charitable expression she only used when there were witnesses watching. My father stood near the donor wall. He looked 20 years older than he had a week earlier. Lydia was nearby, laughing too loudly beside a trustee I recognized from a regional healthcare board. Then my mother saw me. For one perfect second, her entire face forgot how to perform. She crossed the room quickly, Her teeth clenched behind a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Why are you here?" she whispered without moving her lips. I answered just as quietly. "I heard I was part of the story you've been telling." She tried to guide me toward a side corridor, but two women nearby had already noticed the tension in her voice, so she kept smiling for their benefit. "This isn't the place," she muttered. I leaned slightly closer and replied softly, "You made it the place the moment you used my name to hold your version together." That shook her. Her smile tightened, and she hissed that everyone already knew I had become difficult, unstable, and vindictive after abandoning the family during a crisis. I asked her a simple question. "By support, do you mean my credibility, my labor, or the authorization you kept using after telling me not to contact you?" The effect was stronger than I expected, because my father, standing only a few feet away, suddenly looked down at the floor, and my sister rushed over immediately, her perfume sharp in the air and panic written all over her face. "Can you not do this here?" Lydia whispered urgently. "Mom is barely holding it together." But the interesting thing about truth is that it rarely waits for convenient locations. And by that point, people were already starting to listen. "Mom is barely keeping it together," Lydia whispered urgently. I looked at her and remembered every single time she had used tears like a tool. Every time she had cried just long enough to shift the consequences of her choices onto someone else. Usually, onto me. "Interesting," I said quietly, because I remember all of you being very committed to moving forward without me. Lydia grabbed my arm. That was her mistake. Not because it hurt. Because people saw it. First, one trustee turned his head. Then a donor couple standing nearby paused their conversation. Even one of the event coordinators, who already looked exhausted from managing the evening, glanced over with a sharp, suspicious expression. My mother noticed immediately. Eleanor Ward was very good at reading rooms. She adjusted her posture and raised her voice just half a level, carefully calibrating the tone so she sounded wounded instead of defensive. "Thalia, please," she said softly. "This is about your grandmother." That sentence was meant to trap me. If I pushed back, I would look cruel. If I stayed quiet, she would control the story. So instead, I said the quietest thing in the room. "Then, let's talk about Grandma." Silence behaves differently in wealthy rooms. It doesn't slam. It freezes. I asked my mother if the care residents had been told that the deposit for Margaret Ellis's placement depended on a property closing that had not actually happened. Then I turned to my father. "Victor, did the seller know the repairs on the house were more extensive than originally represented?" And then I looked at Lydia. "Did you or did you not tell people that I was still handling compliance?" After I revoked that role in writing, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I just asked questions sharp enough to puncture the version of reality they had built around themselves. My mother tried to shut it down immediately. She called me cruel. My father muttered that this was a private family matter. Lydia started crying on cue. But by then the wrong people were listening. One of the trustees stepped forward slightly. His tone was gentle but unmistakably direct. "Miss Ward," he said, "are you saying you are no longer involved in this transition?" I turned toward him. "Not after I was told not to contact them again," I replied calmly. "I have the message, the withdrawal notices, and the timestamps if anyone would like clarity." My mother's face went completely white. Not angry white. Cornered white. Because she understood exactly what mattered in that room. Not loyalty, not family emotion. Documentation. Within minutes, the board chair quietly pulled her aside. The event coordinator leaned toward someone who appeared to be connected to legal counsel. My father looked like he might be physically sick. Lydia kept repeating that everything was a misunderstanding, but her mascara had started running and no one important was comforting her. Even then, that wasn't the hardest blow. The hardest blow came from someone who had been watching the entire exchange silently. an older woman I had only met twice before. Her name was Margaret Delaney, and she had the kind of wealth that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. She looked directly at my mother and asked one calm question. Eleanor, were charitable commitments discussed before your own household obligations were financially secure? The sentence was so precise, it cut the room cleanly in half. Everyone there understood what she meant. Had Eleanor Ward been performing generosity with money she did not actually control, while her own family obligations were quietly being carried by the daughter she had just publicly criticized? My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. I didn't stay long enough for the scene to turn ugly. There's a point where truth stops being clarification and starts becoming spectacle, and I had no interest in that. So I left. But I didn't leave empty-handed. As I walked toward the coat check, Daniel Pike appeared again, moving quickly through the hallway. He looked very different from the composed attorney who had called me earlier. "Ms. Ward," he said quietly, "could we resolve this?" Discreetly, quietly. That word again. People love the word quietly when they mean before the consequences become permanent. I told him I wasn't interested in spectacle. Only distance. And accuracy? He nodded grimly and explained that my parents were now facing 3 immediate problems. The property sale was collapsing. The charity board had begun asking questions. And there was a growing risk of a complaint involving misrepresentation in the assisted living contract for my grandmother. I looked at him for a moment. "That sounds serious," I said. Then I took my coat and went home. And here's the part most revenge stories never tell you. Public embarrassment doesn't magically heal you. I didn't walk into my apartment feeling triumphant. I didn't celebrate. I just sat in the quiet and felt something strange settle inside my chest. Because when a family uses your silence as building material for their lies, speaking the truth doesn't feel like revenge. Sometimes it just feels like the first act of self-defense. When I got home that night, the quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt electric. My body was wired, my stomach uneasy, and sleep refused to come, no matter how long I lay staring at the ceiling. I kept replaying the moment in the conservatory over and over in my head. Not because I regretted telling the truth, but because people like my family train you to feel guilty the moment you stop absorbing the consequences for them. All weekend, my phone buzzed constantly as their strategy shifted again and again. My father, Victor Ward, sent a message saying my mother's blood pressure had spiked and that whatever this situation had become had clearly gone too far. My sister Lydia wrote 3 long paragraphs about trauma loyalty and how I was punishing everyone over what she called a simple communication misunderstanding. My mother, Eleanor Ward, alternated between silence and short venomous texts, implying I had ruined my grandmother Margaret Ellis's future out of spite. Not one of them acknowledged the simple sequence of events. She told me not to contact them again. They continued relying on my role. I withdrew properly, and their entire illusion collapsed under its own weight. The strange part was that even knowing all of that, my hand still shook every time I opened my inbox. So I did something I had never seriously considered before. I went to therapy. Not because some wise partner suggested it with a comforting one-sentence solution. I went because I realized something unsettling. Even after everything that had happened, some small part of me was still waiting for permission to stop rescuing them. That realization was ugly enough to push me into a therapist's office. Her name was Dr. Elise Mercer. She wasn't the type to flatter clients with inspirational cliches. She listened quietly while I described the situation, and when I finished, she asked one question that stayed lodged in my chest for days. "When did your family first teach you that usefulness was the price of belonging?" I didn't answer immediately. Because once I started thinking about it, the memories lined up too easily. I was 13 when my mother first began pulling me into arguments with my father because I was the calm one who could mediate. 16 when I started reading loan paperwork out loud because the adults in my house preferred optimism to details. 21 when I was told delaying my own plans for a year would be noble if it helped stabilize the family. 28 when I finally realized there would never be one final emergency. Just a rotating cast of disasters connected by entitlement. Dr. Mercer didn't tell me to forgive them. She told me to document my reality. She said writing it down would stop other people from rewriting the story around me. So I did. I wrote down every incident I had quietly minimized for years. The graduate fund that slowly disappeared after my father's failed investment. The fellowship opportunity I missed after my mother insisted I help orchestrate her charity luncheon. The endless caregiving responsibilities that quietly turned into unpaid project management for every crisis my parents created. I wrote about Lydia too, about how she learned very early that tears moved money and effort in her direction faster than honesty ever could. Once everything was written down, the pattern stopped looking like family chaos. It started looking like systematic extraction. And then came the confrontation. My father called a few days later asking if we could meet at the old house. He said he wanted one adult conversation without shouting. Against my better judgment, I agreed. But I didn't go unprepared. Emotionally, I had already anchored myself to facts. I brought screenshots, dates, records. The house looked strange when I arrived. Half-packed and hollow. Designer chairs wrapped in moving blankets. Empty spaces where artwork used to hang. Cracks in the entry trim that had apparently been minor 2 weeks earlier, now impossible to ignore. My mother was already sitting at the dining table when I walked in. She looked composed, like a defendant who still believes charm might persuade the jury. Lydia sat beside her with red eyes and an expression somewhere between fury and humiliation. So much for the private conversation my father had promised. For the first 10 minutes they tried rewriting history. My mother said the voicemail telling me not to contact them had been sent in anger. She claimed it was never meant literally. I listened quietly. Because once people realize they are losing control of the narrative, they start rewriting the past first. My father, Victor Ward, leaned back in his chair and tried to steady the conversation. He said everyone had been under pressure. My sister Lydia quickly followed, insisting no one had actually misused my name. According to her, people had simply assumed I was still involved because I always had been before. That was when I opened the folder I had brought with me. One by one, I placed printed pages on the dining table. The revocation notice, the email exchange with the title company, the accountant's message confirming my withdrawal, the inquiry from the care facility regarding funding assurances, the draft invitation for my mother's donor event, and finally the message from a board member summarizing the statements my mother had been making publicly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I just laid the facts out where everyone could see them. The room changed immediately. Facts have a strange effect on people who rely on ambiguity to survive. They strip away the comfortable gray space manipulators hide inside. And when that space disappears, the real personalities underneath finally step forward. My mother, Eleanor Ward, slammed her hand on the table. For a moment, she didn't even try to pretend. She accused me of enjoying making the rest of the family feel small because I understood how systems worked and they didn't. My father snapped that none of this would have happened if I had simply helped the family instead of acting superior. Then Lydia said something without thinking. "You always act like the money was yours." I looked at her calmly. "Not the money," I said. "The consequences." No one replied. Because that was the truth sitting in the center of the table. They wanted access without accountability. Image without solvency. Dependence without gratitude. In the middle of the argument, my mother revealed something even uglier. Almost casually buried inside her anger, she admitted that the family had expected me to delay buying my own condo that year. According to her, someone responsible had to act like the adult in the family. They had expected me to sacrifice my plans without even asking. Expected. She spoke about my life as if it were a resource the family could reallocate whenever necessary. Something inside me went very still. Not shattered. Still. The kind of quiet that happens when the last excuse finally dies. I looked at the three of them and spoke clearly. I'm done. Not for a week. Not until everyone calmed down. Done. I told them I would not restore any access. I would not attach my name to another transaction. I would not call the charity board the care residents the broker or the accountant on their behalf. If they wanted to explain the promises they had made, they could finally explain them themselves. My father called that cruel. My mother said I was abandoning my own blood. Lydia whispered that I would regret it when Grandma suffered. I looked directly at them. The person who endangered Grandma, I said quietly, was the one who used her as social proof for a move you couldn't afford. Then I stood up and walked out while they were still shouting. The consequences unfolded over the next 6 weeks, and they were worse than I had expected. The sale of the old house didn't just stall, it collapsed completely when the buyer demanded deeper disclosures and a repair credit my parents couldn't absorb. The lakefront townhouse disappeared within days, sold to another buyer who had cleaner paperwork and actual liquidity. The private care residents withdrew their reservation for my grandmother after their internal review flagged inconsistencies in the financial statements provided by my parents. My mother was quietly asked to step back from the charity's Elder Support Committee until recent concerns could be clarified. In social language, that simply means the room no longer trusts you near its money or its reputation. Lydia's carefully curated lifestyle began unraveling next. The joint emergency credit line she had drained suddenly became impossible to hide once no one else was quietly filling the gaps. The boyfriend she had been impressing with expensive restaurants and weekend trips apparently had strong opinions about honesty once collection notices started arriving. And my father, who had spent years maintaining the illusion of quiet authority, eventually accepted consulting work he used to mock, just to keep the growing debt from swallowing everything. As for my grandmother, Margaret Ellis, that was the one thing I refused to allow them to weaponize. I didn't step in and rescue the entire family. Instead, I did something much more controlled. Through a separate documented channel and after confirming that it would not tie me back into my parents' financial chaos, I contacted a social worker I trusted. Together, we secured a modest but reputable placement for my grandmother. No luxury marketing brochures, no charity events, just honest numbers and proper care. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. There was no luxury brochure attached to the placement I arranged for my grandmother, Margaret Ellis. There was no donor dinner storyline and no elegant marketing language about legacy care. Just safe staff, honest numbers, and people who understood that dignity does not require marble countertops or ribbon-cutting ceremonies. When my mother, Eleanor Ward, found out where Margaret had been placed, she called me screaming. She said I had humiliated her. She said I had downgraded my grandmother's future. That word told me everything I needed to know. To her, care had always been about image first and human needs second. The change inside me wasn't that I became cruel. It was that I became unavailable for distortion. I stopped reading every message they sent. My phone no longer dictated my emotional state. I created a separate folder for anything involving legal or financial communication from my family and responded only when absolutely necessary. And when I did respond, it was in writing, brief and factual, with no emotional openings they could use to pull me back into the cycle. I also told several extended relatives a short, simple version of the truth before my mother could finish painting me as unstable or vindictive. Some of them believed me immediately. As it turns out, people had noticed far more about the Ward family dynamics than I had ever realized. Others chose not to believe me. And that was fine. One of the strange freedoms that comes with stepping out of a lifelong family role is realizing you do not have to win every audience. You only have to stop volunteering as the stage. About a month later, Daniel Pike contacted me again. This time, he wasn't threatening legal consequences or trying to persuade me to restore my involvement. He had a much simpler request. Several parties, including the charity board, the assisted living facility, and one of the lenders involved in the property process, wanted the sequence of events documented. He asked if I would sign a statement clarifying the timeline of my withdrawal from all family-related transactions, not for my parents' benefit, for containment. I agreed. The document I signed was precise and unemotional. It listed dates. The moment my mother told me not to contact them again. The exact time I revoked my authorizations. The communications confirming my withdrawal from the transaction chain. It did only one thing. It separated my name from their actions. No dramatic explanation. No revenge speech. Just a clean record. And that clean record was more devastating than any argument could have been. Because once the facts were fixed in writing, my parents could no longer claim that I was the reason their plans had collapsed. Then came the final meeting. The kind of meeting that could have turned this story into one of those tidy reconciliation endings people like to imagine. If I had been a different woman. My mother asked to see me in person, not at a cafe filled with sunlight and background music where conversations can be softened by atmosphere. She asked me to meet her at her attorney's office, because by that point even she understood that everything important between us now required witnesses. I almost declined. But there was one question I still wanted answered. I wanted to see if she was capable of saying a single honest thing without wrapping it in self-pity. When I arrived, Eleanor Ward looked smaller than I remembered. Not humbled in the dramatic, emotional way people romanticize in movies. Smaller in the practical way, consequences shrink people who believed they were untouchable. She didn't begin with an apology. She began with hardship. She talked about how stressful the past weeks had been, how embarrassed the family felt, how much had been lost. I let her talk until she ran out of rearrangements for reality. Then I answered with the only sentence that mattered. You told me not to contact you again. I respected that. You continued using the systems I built after pushing me out. That is why everything broke. She started crying then. Real tears, perhaps. But tears are not truth. They are weather. My father, Victor Ward, sat quietly beside her, staring down at the table. Lydia wasn't there. Apparently, even she understood that the performance wouldn't hold this time. After a long silence, my mother finally asked the question she should have asked years earlier, though not for the reasons people like to imagine. Her voice was quieter now. Is there anything we can do to fix this? My mother, Eleanor Ward, finally asked the question. Is there anything we can do to fix this? There it was. The line, every toxic family hopes will still work after every other bridge has burned. The moment where the useful daughter is supposed to step forward and provide a map back to normal. I looked at her for a long time, and I realized something very simple. The answer was no. Not because I was cruel, because some structures should stay collapsed. You don't rebuild a house on top of a sinkhole just because the people who ignored the warning signs have finally become afraid. So I told her the truth she hated most. You can't fix this with me. You can only live with what happened without turning me into the repair crew again. My mother flinched as if I had struck her. For the first time during the meeting, my father, Victor Ward, spoke. Does this mean you're cutting us off forever? I shook my head. No. You did that first. I'm just refusing to crawl back into the opening. Then I stood up, picked up my coat, and walked out of the office while my mother called my name in the same voice she had used my entire life when she expected reality to rearrange itself for her comfort. This time, it didn't. If you're wondering whether my family ever truly paid the price for everything that happened here, is the honest answer. My mother eventually lost her position on the charity committee and most of the social capital she had built through carefully performed generosity. My father sold the old house months later for far less than they had once bragged about after repairs he could no longer pretend were cosmetic. My sister Lydia downsized quickly and disappeared from the social circles where she used to perform a version of success built on borrowed stability. The family narrative that I was unstable, bitter, and vindictive never fully recovered once people realized something important. For years, I had been the invisible infrastructure beneath the Ward family's reputation. And when the person doing the invisible work finally stepped away, the system collapsed. As for me that fall, I finally bought the condo I had once been expected to postpone because someone else's crisis mattered more than my future. I signed the documents alone. There was no group chat, no family blessing, no dramatic phone call, just a clean pen, a clean title, and the kind of silence that feels earned instead of lonely. Some people believe revenge has to look like shouting or public humiliation or a perfectly delivered line under bright lights. Sometimes it looks quieter than that. Sometimes it looks like documentation, boundaries, and the refusal to keep your enemies warm simply because they share your last name. Sometimes the deepest form of revenge is letting people experience the full weight of the life they built on top of your unpaid loyalty. So I want to ask you something honestly. If your own family cut you off, kept using your name to hold their plans together, and only panicked once the system stopped working without you, would you have gone back? Or would you have let them continue moving forward exactly the way they asked? Because in the end, this story isn't really about revenge. It's about the moment someone finally stops being the emotional and financial safety net for people who only value them when they are useful. And the most powerful part of that moment is realizing that protecting your peace is not cruelty. Sometimes it's the first honest decision you've ever made. There is something I learned the hard way in this story. Love should never require you to disappear so that everyone else can stay comfortable. For years, I believed being the reliable one meant fixing every crisis, smoothing every mistake, and staying quiet so the family image would survive. But silence can slowly turn a person into a tool instead of a human being. The moment I stepped back, everything that had been hidden became visible. And strangely, that was the first honest moment my life had in a long time. If you listened all the way to the end of this story, I'm curious about something. What would you have done if you were standing where I stood? Would you have returned to fix everything again, or would you have chosen to protect your own peace for once? Thank you for staying here and listening to my story until the end. Stories like this matter because someone out there might be living through something similar and still thinks they have no choice. If this story meant something to you, a small action from you can help it reach that person. A like, a comment, or a subscription might feel simple, but it helps these stories travel further. Your support could help someone else realize they deserve respect, boundaries, and a life that belongs to them.